As financial analysts in Moscow finalized their end-of-year reports, a statement from the Kremlin reverberated through diplomatic channels and into the heart of Europe. Russian officials, led by President Vladimir Putin, issued a stark warning. If the European Union proceeded with any form of expropriation or further utilization of Russia's frozen assets, Moscow would respond with the total seizure of all European Union-linked assets within its borders. This threat, estimated to encompass over $120 billion in corporate holdings from companies like Volkswagen, Shell, and Société Générale, marked a rapid escalation in the financial war that has simmered since the outset of the Ukraine conflict. By midday, European stock markets showed signs of unease, with banking indices dipping modestly amid whispers of retaliatory measures. The announcement came just days after the EU's Brussels summit, where leaders had backed away from outright asset confiscation in favor of a more cautious loan scheme for Ukraine. But Russia's rhetoric suggested that even this compromise was insufficient to deter countermeasures. What began as a sanctions regime designed to isolate Russia had evolved into a high-stakes standoff, threatening to unravel decades of economic interdependence and ignite a broader crisis in global finance. This is the account of how Russia's threats of total asset seizure have intensified the financial war with the European Union, exposing the fragile underbelly of international relations and the perils of economic coercion. To fully understand the gravity of this escalation, we must begin with the foundational elements of the conflict and the role of financial sanctions in modern geopolitics. Sanctions are economic measures imposed by one country or group of countries on another to influence behavior, often without direct military engagement. They can include trade restrictions, travel bans, or asset freezes, and are intended to apply pressure by limiting access to resources, markets, or technology. In the context of international law, sanctions must align with principles set by bodies like the United Nations, but unilateral actions by powerful nations or blocs often test these boundaries. The European Union, a supranational organization comprising 27 member states as of 2025, coordinates its foreign policy through the Common Foreign and Security Policy, allowing it to impose collective sanctions that carry the weight of a major economic power. The roots of this particular financial war trace back to February 24, 2022, when Russian forces launched a full-scale military operation in Ukraine. This action, which Russia described as a special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, was widely condemned by the West as an unprovoked invasion violating Ukraine's sovereignty. In response, the United States, the European Union, and allies like the United Kingdom and Japan swiftly implemented a series of unprecedented sanctions. Among the most impactful was the freezing of Russian central bank assets held abroad. A central bank is a nation's primary monetary authority, responsible for managing currency, interest rates, and foreign exchange reserves. Stockpiles of foreign currencies, gold, and securities used to stabilize the economy and facilitate international trade. Russia's reserves, amassed from oil and gas exports, totaled around $640 billion pre-invasion, with roughly half held in Western institutions. The EU's portion of the freeze amounted to approximately €210 billion, or about $230 billion at 2022 exchange rates. These assets were primarily custodied at Euroclear, a Belgium-based central securities depository that acts as a safekeeper and settlement system for bonds, stocks, and other financial instruments. Euroclear, founded in 1968, processes trillions in transactions annually and is integral to the Eurozone's financial infrastructure. Under EU regulations, specifically Council Regulation 833/2014, Euroclear was compelled to immobilize these holdings, meaning Russia could no longer access or transfer them, though they continued to accrue interest. This freeze was part of a broader strategy to deprive Russia of funds for its military efforts. By locking away reserves, the West aimed to induce ruble devaluation, inflation, and economic contraction in Russia. Initially, the ruble fell sharply, but Moscow's countermeasures, capital controls, high interest rates, and redirected trade to Asia stabilized the currency. The sanctions also excluded Russia from SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, a Belgium-based messaging network that facilitates global payments. Exclusion from SWIFT complicated Russia's international transactions, forcing reliance on alternatives like China's CIPS or bilateral systems. As the war persisted into 2023 and 2024, debates in Europe shifted from freezing to utilizing the assets. The holdings generated substantial interest estimated at 3 to 5 billion euros annually due to reinvestment in low-risk bonds. In May 2024, the EU approved a mechanism to redirect 90% of these windfall profits to Ukraine after fees and taxes. Belgium, as Euroclear's host, collected a 25% tax, funneling billions into its treasury. This move blurred the line between freezing and expropriation, which is the permanent taking of property without compensation, often illegal under international law principles like sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity protects a state's assets from seizure by foreign courts, rooted in treaties like the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. Russia argued the freeze violated this, as well as bilateral investment treaties signed in the 1990s that guarantee fair treatment of assets. These treaties allow arbitration in neutral forums like the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, where Russia could seek damages. The escalation intensified in 2025. In January, EU discussions on a €165 billion reparations loan to Ukraine, secured against frozen assets, gained traction. This G7-backed plan aimed to advance funds Kyiv could repay from future Russian reparations. However, legal risks loomed. Outright seizure could invite lawsuits under old treaties, potentially costing Europe billions in penalties. Countries like Hungary and Slovakia voiced opposition, citing fears of Russian retaliation. Step by step, the events built toward the current crisis. In October 2025, EU finance ministers advanced the loan proposal, requiring unanimous approval. Belgium emerged as a key skeptic, concerned about liabilities for Euroclear, which holds 185 to 193 billion euros of the assets. On December 12, Russia's central bank filed a lawsuit in Moscow's arbitration court against Euroclear, seeking 18.2 trillion rubles, about $229 billion, in damages for the freeze and lost interest. This lawfare, using legal systems for strategic ends, aimed to deter escalation. The Brussels summit on December 1819 became the flashpoint. Leaders debated the loan amid Russia's warnings. Putin, in a December 19 address, labeled EU plans robbery and vowed symmetric measures, including total seizure of Western assets in Russia. These assets, from energy firms like BP to manufacturers like Siemens, are valued at $200 to $300 billion. Under a 2022 decree, Russia can nationalize them for unfriendly actions. Faced with this, the EU compromised. A €90 billion loan for Ukraine over 2026-2027, funded by member state borrowing rather than asset collateral. The freeze was made indefinite, but principle remained untouched. Yet Russia's threat persisted, signaling that even indirect use could trigger retaliation. Hidden factors include Russian intelligence operations targeting Belgian officials, as revealed in leaks to sow doubt. Old treaties with Russia, predating EU membership for some states, expose Europe to arbitration claims. Internal EU divisions, fiscal conservatives like Germany fear shared debt, while Eastern states push for aggression. Russia's economic resilience, GDP growth of 3% in 2025 despite sanctions, emboldens it. Global implications. Erosion of trust in Western finance could accelerate de-dollarization, with BRICS advancing alternatives. Emerging markets may diversify reserves, raising U.S. borrowing costs. Economic fallout. Higher energy prices if Russia cuts supplies, job losses in seized firms. Geopolitically, it strains NATO unity and encourages hybrid warfare. In conclusion, Russia's threats of total seizure mark a dangerous turn in the financial war, where economic tools risk boomeranging. Thoughtful diplomacy is needed to de-escalate, perhaps linking assets to peace talks. The escalation warns of a multipolar world where power is contested not just on battlefields but in boardrooms. Offers a moment of global respite amid holiday observances. The tensions surrounding Russia's threats of asset seizure against European Union interests continue to underscore the precarious nature of the ongoing financial confrontation. The warning issued on December 24, reiterating the potential for comprehensive nationalization of EU-linked holdings within Russia, estimated at over $120 billion in corporate investments and financial positions, has prompted cautious assessments in Brussels and major European capitals. This stance follows the European Council's decisions earlier in the month to extend the immobilization of Russian central bank assets indefinitely, while approving a €90 billion loan facility for Ukraine, funded through conventional EU borrowing mechanisms. Russia's position, articulated through official statements and diplomatic notes, maintains that any perceived encroachment on its frozen reserves, even indirect, would justify reciprocal actions under domestic law. While no immediate seizures have been enacted, the rhetoric has heightened awareness of the mutual vulnerabilities inherent in prolonged economic coercion. The developments of late 2025 have unfolded against a backdrop of sustained diplomatic and legal maneuvering. The indefinite extension of the asset freeze, agreed upon on December 12, eliminated the previous 6-month renewal requirement, addressing potential veto points within the unanimous decision-making process of the EU. This measure ensured continuity of the immobilization, covering approximately €210 billion, primarily held at Euroclear in Belgium. The subsequent summit on December 18 and 19 focused on Ukraine's financing needs, resulting in the €90 billion commitment, structured as interest-free loans backed by the EU budget. This approach deliberately avoided direct linkage to the frozen Russian principal or its derived income, reflecting compromises to accommodate concerns raised by member states regarding legal and financial risks. Russia's response has emphasized judicial and legislative preparedness. The central bank's lawsuit against Euroclear, filed on December 12 and seeking substantial damages, proceeds toward its preliminary hearing in January 2026. Additional announcements indicate intentions to extend similar claims to other European entities involved in asset management. Domestic legislation, including decrees from 2022 and subsequent amendments, provides the framework for potential countermeasures, allowing the state to assume control of foreign-owned entities deemed strategic or in response to hostile actions. Step by step, these positions have solidified through formal communications and public declarations. Initial warnings in the autumn months escalated with the lawsuit filing, coinciding with EU deliberations. The summit outcome prompted renewed statements from Moscow, framing the loan decision as insufficient de-escalation. Diplomatic exchanges in the intervening days have reiterated the conditional nature of Russia's restraint, contingent on the non-utilization of its immobilized reserves. Less examined dimensions contribute to the complexity of this standoff. The concentration of frozen assets in a single jurisdiction, like Belgium, amplifies leverage for individual member states in EU negotiations, as evidenced by ongoing demands for indemnification. Historical bilateral investment treaties between Russia and certain EU countries, predating full integration, create potential avenues for arbitration claims that could result in compensatory awards. Economic interdependencies persist despite sanctions. European firms maintain operational presence in Russia through localized structures, while energy flows, though reduced, retain significance in select markets. Intelligence assessments suggest coordinated information efforts to influence public and political opinion within Europe regarding the costs of continued confrontation. The global implications remain substantial and multifaceted. The prolonged immobilization sustains economic pressure on Russia, limiting fiscal options amid ongoing expenditures. For Ukraine, the approved financing provides critical support for defense and reconstruction planning into the medium term. Within the European Union, the chosen funding mechanism adds to collective borrowing obligations in an environment of elevated interest rates, potentially constraining national budgets. Perceptions of custodial reliability for sovereign assets may evolve among non-aligned nations, influencing long-term reserve allocation preferences. Broader fragmentation risks include incentives for parallel financial systems, raising transaction costs, and complicating enforcement of future restrictive measures. On this Christmas Day of 2025, Russia's articulated threats of comprehensive asset seizure highlight the rapid intensification possible in financial confrontations, yet the absence of immediate action reflects calculated restraint on both sides. The EU's pragmatic adjustments demonstrate adaptability in pursuing objectives while managing internal and external risks. In broader contemplation, this phase of the dispute illuminates the inherent limitations of economic instruments in resolving geopolitical conflicts. Sanctions and countermeasures, while capable of imposing costs, also engender reciprocal vulnerabilities that can prolong impasses. Sustainable pathways forward necessitate nuanced approaches, robust legal protections for intermediaries, clear delineations in asset treatment, and exploratory linkages to comprehensive diplomatic frameworks. The measured outcomes of December 2025 create space for reassessment, affirming that strategic patience can preserve leverage more effectively than precipitous escalation. As proceedings advance in legal arenas and support mechanisms activate for Ukraine, the emphasis must remain on architectures that reinforce accountability alongside systemic stability. In this extended equilibrium, deliberate calibration serves as the guardian of progress, guiding stakeholders toward resolutions that transcend confrontation and contribute to a more secure international framework. The developments persist, shaped by the imperative of balance in an interconnected economic order. A sense of quiet across international markets and diplomatic offices, the standoff over Russia's potential seizure of European Union assets remains a defining element of the prolonged financial and geopolitical tensions stemming from the Ukraine conflict. The explicit threat, articulated on December 24, encompassing the possible full nationalization of EU-associated investments and positions within Russia, valued at approximately $120 to $150 billion, depending on sectoral assessments, serves as a pointed reminder of the reciprocal risks embedded in extended economic sanctions regimes. This position, maintained through consistent official communications, conditions any restraint on the complete avoidance of measures perceived as encroaching upon Russia's immobilized sovereign reserves. The European Union's recent decisions to perpetuate the asset freeze indefinitely while structuring a €90 billion support package for Ukraine through standard budgetary instruments reflect an effort to sustain pressure without crossing thresholds that could provoke immediate retaliation. No concrete seizures have been initiated as of this date, indicating a phase of calibrated posturing on both sides. The sequence of late 2025 has been characterized by precise diplomatic and legal positioning. The agreement on December 12 to render the freeze permanent removed procedural vulnerabilities associated with periodic unanimity requirements. The Brussels summit deliberations on December 18 and 19 prioritized securing tangible assistance for Ukraine while navigating internal concerns over liability and escalation. The resulting loan framework, reliant on joint EU borrowing capacity, deliberately eschewed direct recourse to the frozen principal or segregated income streams, preserving the assets as latent leverage for future reparations claims. Russia's articulated countermeasures, framed within existing legislative decrees, underscore preparedness to act symmetrically should interpretations of EU actions shift. Step by step, the discourse has evolved through layered statements and preparatory actions. Pre-summit warnings established clear red lines. Post-summit responses reaffirmed conditional tolerance, emphasizing legal avenues alongside potential administrative measures. Ongoing judicial proceedings, including the central bank's claim against Euroclear, provide parallel tracks for pursuing redress without immediate economic disruption. Understated aspects continue to shape the equilibrium. The asymmetric distribution of frozen assets, heavily concentrated in one member state's jurisdiction, grants disproportionate influence in collective decision-making, as demonstrated by persistent negotiations over risk-sharing. Legacy bilateral agreements between Russia and individual EU nations offer potential forums for dispute resolution outside the bloc's framework, introducing uncertainty regarding enforceable outcomes. Residual economic linkages, through localized operations, joint ventures, or indirect supply chains, complicate full decoupling, creating incentives for restraint amid threats. Strategic communication efforts, including public messaging and targeted diplomacy, aim to influence stakeholder perceptions regarding the sustainability of current policies. The international ramifications persist in their depth and breadth. Sustained immobilization constrains Russia's budgetary flexibility, supporting allied objectives in the context of the conflict. Ukraine gains predictable medium-term financing, essential for operational continuity and planning. For the European Union, the financing approach distributes burdens across members while avoiding concentrated exposure for custodial entities. Long-term considerations for sovereign asset management may prompt reviews among third-party nations regarding depository choices and reserve compositions. Incentives for alternative financial architectures could strengthen, potentially elevating costs for cross-border transactions and challenging uniformity in restrictive measures. On this Christmas Day of 2025, Russia's threats of total asset seizure exemplify the swift escalation potential within financial confrontations, yet the absence of execution reflects mutual recognition of prohibitive costs. The EU's measured adaptations illustrate institutional resilience in balancing solidarity with prudence. In comprehensive reflection, this juncture reveals the profound challenges of employing economic instruments in deep-seated disputes. Sanctions regimes, effective in applying calibrated pressure, inevitably generate counterpressures that test resolve and unity. Viable trajectories demand sophisticated strategies, comprehensive safeguards for neutral intermediaries, precise boundaries in asset handling, and structured channels tying resolution to broader diplomatic progress. The deliberate choices of December 2025 afford essential breathing room for evaluation, confirming that tempered application often sustains influence more durably than maximalist postures. As legal processes unfold and assistance mechanisms engage, priority must center on frameworks that uphold responsibility while preserving systemic coherence. In this prolonged balance, thoughtful stewardship emerges as the arbiter of outcomes, directing parties toward arrangements that mitigate antagonism and nurture conditions for eventual reconciliation. The episode endures, informed by the necessity of proportion in a deeply interlinked global economy. Draws to a close in a period of international calm, the ongoing discourse regarding Russia's potential seizure of European Union assets continues to reflect the deep-seated challenges in the financial dimensions of the Ukraine conflict. The reiterated threat from Moscow on December 24, outlining the possibility of comprehensive appropriation of EU-related investments and holdings within Russian jurisdiction, assessed at $120 to $150 billion across various sectors, serves to maintain pressure amid the EU's recent policy adjustments. This posture aligns with prior warnings, conditioning any forbearance on the strict non-interference with Russia's immobilized sovereign reserves. The European Union's framework, solidified through the indefinite asset freeze and the €90 billion financing commitment to Ukraine via established budgetary channels, demonstrates a strategy of sustained support tempered by risk mitigation. No material actions toward seizure have been reported, suggesting a continued phase of strategic signaling rather than kinetic escalation. The progression in the final weeks of 2025 has been marked by refined positioning through official channels. The December 12 consensus on perpetual immobilization addressed structural weaknesses in the sanctions architecture. The summit outcomes on December 18 and 19 prioritized delivering assistance to Ukraine while incorporating safeguards against potential liabilities for custodial institutions and member states. Russia's communications have consistently framed its preparedness as defensive, rooted in domestic legal provisions that authorize reciprocal measures in response to perceived expropriatory acts. Step by step, the exchange has maintained a pattern of conditional rhetoric. Preceding statements established boundaries. Summit decisions elicited clarifications emphasizing proportionality. Subsequent notes have reinforced the linkage between EU restraint and Russian inaction, preserving room for diplomatic interpretation. Overlooked facets add layers to this dynamic. The jurisdictional concentration of assets influences intra-EU bargaining power, as seen in negotiations over shared protections. Pre-existing investment accords between Russia and specific member states introduce parallel legal tracks that could yield independent outcomes. Lingering operational ties, through adapted corporate structures or supply agreements, create mutual deterrence against full severance. Coordinated messaging strategies aim to shape narratives around the long-term viability of current approaches. The wider international consequences are enduring and layered. Continued immobilization imposes ongoing constraints on Russian fiscal options, aligning with strategic aims in the conflict context. Ukraine secures structured medium-term resources vital for resilience and recovery efforts. For the European Union, the financing modality distributes responsibilities equitably while sidestepping immediate custodial exposures. Considerations for sovereign asset safekeeping may prompt gradual reevaluations among neutral parties regarding depository preferences. Motivations for diversified financial channels could intensify, potentially increasing complexity in coordinated global responses. On this Christmas Day of 2025, Russia's threats of total asset seizure underscore the accelerated risks inherent in financial warfare, yet the lack of implementation points to shared awareness of escalatory thresholds. The EU's calibrated responses affirm capacity for unified action amid diverse interests. In extended reflection, this installment in the confrontation elucidates the bounded efficacy of economic levers in entrenched disputes. Restrictive measures, potent for graduated influence, concurrently provoke adaptive countermeasures that prolong stalemates. Constructive horizons require layered methodologies, exhaustive indemnities for neutral facilitators, unambiguous protocols in asset administration, and facilitated conduits connecting financial questions to holistic resolution processes. The prudent determinations of December 2025 yield indispensable interval for deliberation, verifying that moderated postures frequently secure objectives more reliably than absolute demands. As Judicial Avenue. As progress and aid structures operationalize, focus should anchor on systems that advance responsibility in tandem with structural integrity. In this sustained poise, judicious governance functions as the compass for advancement, orienting involved parties toward configurations that alleviate hostility and lay groundwork for prospective accord. The narrative unfolds further, governed by the demand for moderation in a profoundly entwined global landscape. Fades into evening across time zones. The intricate standoff concerning Russia's potential seizure of European Union assets persists as a central thread in the fabric of contemporary geopolitical and financial relations. The resolute threat conveyed on December 24, detailing the prospect of exhaustive appropriation of EU-affiliated investments and positions situated within Russian territory, quantified at approximately $120 to $150 billion encompassing diverse industries, continues to inform strategic calculations in European policymaking circles. This articulation aligns seamlessly with established positions, positing that any deviation from absolute non-interference with Russia's immobilized reserves would warrant proportionate defensive actions under prevailing national legislation. The European Union's consolidated stance, manifested through the perpetual extension of the asset immobilization and the structured €90 billion assistance framework for Ukraine utilizing conventional fiscal instruments, exemplifies a commitment to Allied support balanced against prudent exposure management. Absent any substantive implementation of seizures to date, the current interval reflects a deliberate mutual calibration of pressures and responses. The closing phase of 2025 has been defined by meticulous articulation of boundaries through authoritative channels. The December 12 Accord on Enduring Immobilization fortified the sanctions construct by obviating recurring consensus obligations. The summit resolutions of December 18 and 19 centered on furnishing reliable aid to Ukraine while integrating mechanisms to distribute risks equitably among members. Russia's enunciated contingencies, grounded in enacted legal provisions, emphasize symmetry as a principle guiding potential reciprocity. Step by step, the interaction has adhered to a framework of explicit conditionality. Antecedent declarations delineated unacceptable thresholds, Summit conclusions prompted reiterations underscoring interpretive latitude. Ensuing clarifications have sustained the nexus between perceived restraint and continued forbearance, allowing scope for nuanced diplomatic engagement. Subtler dynamics enrich the understanding of this equilibrium. The localized aggregation of immobilized holdings confers amplified negotiating weight to specific jurisdictions within the collective process, as recurrent discussions on liability allocation illustrate. Antiquated bilateral accords between Russia and constituent EU entities present autonomous avenues for adjudication that could produce divergent obligations. Enduring commercial interconnections, manifested in restructured operations or ancillary partnerships, engender inherent disincentives to absolute rupture. Deliberate informational initiatives seek to mold perceptions concerning the endurance and proportionality of existing trajectories. The international repercussions maintain their depth across interconnected domains. Persistent immobilization exerts continuing limitations on Russian resource mobilization, consonant with coalition goals amid the protracted situation. Ukraine benefits from dependable multi-year provisioning critical for strategic sustenance and infrastructural reclamation. Within the European Union, the elected financing paradigm apportions commitments proportionally while circumventing acute vulnerabilities for intermediary institutions. Deliberations on sovereign asset custodianship may catalyze incremental reassessments among extraneous parties regarding optimal depository alignments. Impetus toward parallel transactional ecosystems could consolidate, introducing augmented operational intricacies for synchronized global initiatives. On this Christmas Day of 2025, Russia's threats of total asset seizure illuminate the precipitous escalation trajectories latent in financial confrontations, yet the withholding of execution signifies reciprocal appreciation of prohibitive mutual consequences. The EU's discerning modifications evince institutional agility in harmonizing cohesion with circumspection. In thorough reflection, this segment of the engagement elucidates the circumscribed potency of economic modalities within intractable disputes. Punitive frameworks, adept at metered application, concomitantly elicit resilient adaptations that perpetuate gridlock. Feasible avenues necessitate multifaceted methodologies, thoroughgoing assurances for impartial facilitators, rigorous demarcations in asset governance, and orchestrated faces associating monetary queries with overarching conciliatory endeavors. The judicious selections of December 2025 furnish vital respite for contemplation, substantiating that modulated orientations habitually retain efficacy more steadfastly than unyielding imperatives. As adjudicative sequences advance and provisioning architectures mobilize, orientation should fixate on constructs that promote liability concomitant with foundational soundness. In this protracted symmetry, sagacious oversight operates as the navigator of evolution, steering participants toward dispositions that assuage antagonism and cultivate prerequisites for eventual harmony. The chronicle advances, modulated by the exigency of restraint in a thoroughly interwoven global milieu.